is Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Tonight we come to you with breaking news. Iran retaliates. Days after the U.S. attack on Iranian nuclear sites, Tehran fires missiles toward U.S. bases in Qatar and Iraq after the regime warned of a proportional response. President Trump tonight calling that response, quote, very weak.
Former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta joins us on the significance of the retaliation. Plus, we'll have congressional reaction with Democratic Congresswoman Becca Balint of Vermont.
And the global impact on oil, with the possibility of Iran trying to choke off crucial tanker traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. We'll look at the president's call to boost domestic drilling in anticipation.
We've got several developing stories playing out tonight on the conflict between the U.S. and Iran, but we begin live at the White House, where Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan is standing by. So, Kate, we have heard from President Trump via a post on Truth Social in which he suggests he believes Iran has now gotten it out of its system in terms of retaliation, and hopefully, to use the president's words, there will be no further hate. Does that mean that the U.S. does not intend to respond to today's attack?
That's certainly what it appears to be signaling. So with the few posts that Trump had just a short while ago, it really seems like he's saying that the United States at this moment is not gearing up for any further action against Iran after the attacks today on the air bases in Qatar. He posted, "It's time for peace." He said that there were no casualties or injuries, and he actually thanked Iran for providing advance notice of the attack, which he said was the reason that they were able to have no casualties or injuries. So things can, of course, change very quickly. This is a very fluid situation. But at this moment, everything that we know about this attack today suggests that Iran was really looking to have a symbolic show of force here, and that ultimately they were looking to provide an off-ramp and de-escalate. So we know that because the plans were telegraphed well in advance. That was something that Trump just confirmed again in his Truth Social post. And this allowed, there were the base, which actually it's interesting. I was just at this base with Trump about a month ago. Trump spoke to U.S. military personnel. So this base is the largest U.S. military installation in the Middle East. It was a likely target. And so leading up to this attack, a lot of the U.S. personnel had already been evacuated from the base, and they had actually moved a lot of the aircraft and the U.S. planes off of there. So another thing that I would note is that Iranian officials, in order to really emphasize and underscore the fact that this was, in their view, a proportional response, said that, the number of missiles that were used in this attack was the exact number of bombs that the United States dropped on the on the nuclear facilities in Iran over the weekend.
Yeah, right. Kate, I just want to ask you quickly about what's going on in that building behind you. We've not actually heard from President Trump today, just seen a number of posts on social media. We do know he was in the Situation Room watching this all unfold today, the response from Iran, with his Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Do we know when we'll see the president again?
We actually do not. Like you said, we just heard from him on social media. At this moment, there are no plans to hear from the president directly on camera. And I would also add that, as of right now, he is still supposed to go to the NATO summit in The Hague. He's supposed to leave tomorrow morning. We have not heard that those plans have changed, but of course, that could always change. He could send a representative. He could send Vice President J.D. Vance in his place. We're just not sure yet at this time.
Kate, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan on a sweltering North Lawn at the White House. Joining us now with more is Leon Panetta, the former Secretary of Defense, former director of the CIA. Mr. Secretary, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to have you. Are we done here? Iran fires missiles at our base in Qatar. We intercept them. President Trump says no further hate. Is this over?
I think it would be a mistake to assume that everything is now hunky-dory between the United States and Iran. The fact is they did fire missiles. If one of those missiles had gotten through, we wouldn't feel the same way. I think the likelihood is that this is the beginning, not the end, of Iran continuing to try various approaches to retaliation. But more importantly, I don't think Iran is interested in negotiating a settlement right now, and that's what really counts.
Well, if you don't think this is the end, but only the beginning, what do you expect to see next, Mr. Secretary? Are we talking about asymmetric means? Is it risk of terrorism here that you're most worried about, or could they target energy infrastructure in this region in their next move?
Well, the reality is that all of the above. They have options with regards to the energy area, although that obviously could hurt them as well as others. They are a country that has deployed cells into other countries. There probably are Iranian cells in this country that we have to be very careful of, and that could result in some kind of attacks. Look, the bottom line is that they have a number of options. My sense is that right now they're playing for time. They don't want to suddenly get into an escalated war, but at the same time, they are doing everything to kind of protect their options for the future as well.
Well, with the idea of an asymmetric response and potentially activating sleeper cells in this country, we spoke on the early edition of Balance of Power today with Michael Allen from Beacon Global Strategies, whether he believes these cells would be, in fact, part of Iran's strategy moving forward. Secretary, here's how he put it.
I think over time, this is the primary tool that the Iranians have. I think over time, the Iranian regime will try to return to that, maybe to hit embassies overseas, certainly maybe targets of opportunity if they're soldiers that are unprotected. But I have a hard time seeing them succeed in a big way here in the United States. That's not to rule it out completely, because I know they want to get over here, but I really don't see it as a huge threat, because I believe that we have superior intelligence.
Leon Panetta, we talk to you so frequently as a former defense secretary. If you put your former CIA hat on in this case, is he right there about intelligence? And if you, in fact, were still in the agency, how would you go about finding these so-called sleeper cells?
Well, I would hope that our intelligence is keeping track of whether or not there are potential sleeper cells here in the United States. We certainly did that when I was director of the CIA, and we actually took steps to stop some potential attacks that could have taken place in this country as well. So I would hope that our intelligence is on alert, that the FBI are on alert, and that, frankly, law enforcement is on the alert as well, because Iran does use those types of attacks. They've used it in the Middle East. They've used it in Latin America. And the reality is that they would use it here if given the opportunity.
Well, of course, it then becomes a question of whether Iran, as we've known it for the last several decades, remains the Iran of the future in terms of how these things play out, both domestically inside Iran and internationally. Knowing the administration, at least most officials have suggested regime change is not the intended objective with the moves we've seen over the last few days, though President Trump has suggested that regime change may be needed to make Iran great again. Do you view that as being ultimately Israel's objective, as Israel is showing no signs of slowing down its own strikes against Iran?
Well, I don't think it's any mystery that Israel would love to see a regime change, and they'll probably continue to try to do whatever they can in order to make that happen. But I don't think the United States is there, because the reality is, if you really want to change the regime in Iran, you're going to have to put boots on the ground. It's not just something that's going to happen because you're conducting air attacks in Iran. So I really do think that if there isn't any kind of regime change, that the issue then becomes how long does this war continue? What types of attacks are conducted? Is it a prolonged war? What represents the end game? Always easy to get into war, always much tougher to figure out how to get out of war. And I think the end game still remains to be decided here.
Secretary, I want to ask you about the idea of notification for the sake of protocol and for the sake of effectiveness. with an operation like this. We know that the Gang of Eight was not notified, at least not Democrats, including the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. This is, I imagine, not how you would have gone about things, knowing that in the past, key members of Congress would be briefed on a mission like this in advance, in secret. We're hearing from the administration, and this, by the way, was reinforced by Congressman Darrell Issa as part of our special coverage last evening, that this may be some sort of new normal. The White House is celebrating the fact that there were no leaks, knowing what happened with Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, and his situation involving Signal. Leon Panetta, is this the new normal?
I hope not. I really hope that's not the case, because I think military action, foreign policy, relations really ought to be bipartisan. And we ought to continue to reach out. The president ought to continue to reach out to both sides on Capitol Hill. When we were in the process of conducting the bin Laden raid, I made it a point to go up to Capitol Hill and brief the Gang of Eight to make clear what we were doing. And nothing leaked from those conversations. So I hope that the president, if he really wants to have a strong bipartisan approach to foreign policy and to our military policy, will reach out and try to get bipartisan support. That's the only way to do it right.
Well, Mr. Secretary, as we consider the U.S.'s military policy and stance against Iran, I also wonder if you think we're likely to see any real players stepping up for Iran, on Iran's behalf, as we consider Russia and China here, who have maybe rhetorically expressed support for Iran. Do you expect they play a material role going forward in helping keep the regime afloat?
Well, that's the question of the moment right now. Obviously, the foreign minister has visited or is in the process of visiting Russia. I'm sure the purpose of that would be to get military assistance from Russia. Iran provided military assistance to Russia in Ukraine, and they're now going to ask for that favor to be returned, I'm sure. And the same thing's true for China. So I hope our intelligence keeps track of this to determine whether or not Russia, Putin, or Xi decide that they're going to provide any kind of military assistance to Iran, because that obviously would represent a greater continuation of this war.
President Trump writing on Truth Social about an hour ago, "Congratulations, world. It's time for peace." In all caps, exclamation point. If you were still running the Pentagon, to what extent would you be concerned with force protection going forward? How long would you need to be looking out for the safety of men and women in uniform who are serving in the Middle East?
I think we have to continue to be very vigilant with regards to protecting our forces. I would not take anything for granted. I certainly wouldn't assume that everything is going to be great with Iran at this point. I think we have to operate on the defensive, make sure that our people are protected, our troops are protected, our bases are protected, that American citizens are protected, because we are still in what I would call a state of war with Iran, and we have to be very careful about making sure that we defend ourselves.
Do we risk, though, Mr. Secretary, if we put greater focus and greater resources in the Middle East in the name of that force protection, of losing ground, taking our eye off the ball in other theaters?
Well, I think it's very important to maintain our presence in the Middle East. We've got 45,000 troops there. We have some very important bases that are important to our ability to do outreach in the Middle East. I think we've got to maintain those bases. The United States is a world power. The president's proven that over these last number of days. So we have to be strong enough, prepared enough to not only defend our presence in the world, but defend our people from any threat of retaliation.
All right, Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense during the Obama administration, also, of course, former director of the CIA. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, we did see oil prices plunging today after Iran's retaliatory strikes were seen, at least in energy markets, as being less severe than investors feared, alleviating some concern that tensions would immediately interrupt supply across the region. But still, as the secretary was just speaking to, there are multiple risks potentially in the region and for crude flows, including a retaliatory closure of the key waterway, the Strait of Hormuz. Here's what some industry experts have had to say about that earlier on Bloomberg.
Economically, it wouldn't make sense for Iran to try to close the Strait of Hormuz. Market and energy traders are still trying to understand what is the calculus here, what is going on, what could Iran do next.
You can create a scenario very easily where oil spikes. It has been surprising to me that oil has been very well behaved so far.
Just because the market is being resilient doesn't mean that the risk isn't going to come back and bite it later.
Joining us now from World Headquarters in New York is Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick. And Romaine, we just heard oil being described as well behaved, yet we saw the biggest drop in crude futures since, what, 2022 today?
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest volatility as well, the biggest intraday swing since 2022. And we should point out, 2022, of course, that was the year that Russia made that invasion into Ukraine, which drove much of the volatility that year. But what you saw today and what you see on your screen right now is really a reflection of two things, Kaylee. A, the Strait of Hormuz is still open. The most recent data that Bloomberg has been tracking, that as of yesterday on Sunday, 44 ships moved through that space, oil carriers specifically moved through that space, about evenly split between inbound and outbound, which suggests here that there really has not been much of a disruption. 40 to 50 has basically been the number that's been moving through there for the past few weeks. So that continued on Sunday. It'll be interesting to see what the Monday numbers show. But the other big issue, and the one that I think you really saw the drop in oil prices, was after we learned about those volleys by Iran into, or at least towards, the U.S. base in Qatar. The big relief there was not just that they were intercepted, but that none of those missiles appeared to be targeting any sort of energy infrastructure in the region. That was the big fear, that it drove oil prices higher. The fact that we did not get that is a big reason why you see oil prices lower.
I was struck by your analysis last evening, Romaine, when this was still so fresh, the idea being that Wall Street has suddenly eliminated the great existential threat that it has faced for the past 30 years in dismantling Iran's nuclear program. The rest of it we'll deal with another time. But you look at the S&P 500 today, back above 6,000. We're creeping back back toward the all-time high. To what extent can investors justify pushing this higher?
They're going to justify it as long as the corporate fundamentals hold up. We spoke with Ed Yardeni on the close just a little while ago, Mark Lehman over at JMP, and a few other Wall Street strategists and portfolio managers, and they all said the same thing, that unless there is a material risk on shipping lanes, trading lanes, and the infrastructure that feeds into that, there's no reason for Wall Street to be rattled. I would just point out, Joe, midday, Wall Street got rattled. And of course, that was when we started to learn about all of those missiles flying out of Iran. And you saw a huge drop in equity prices. But of course, that quickly reversed once there was evidence that those missiles had been intercepted. So this is still a market on edge. Don't necessarily get complacent there, Joe. But yes, at 6,025 on the S&P 500, we're within reasonable distance of reclaiming that all-time high.
Remarkable. Romaine Bostick reporting for Bloomberg from World Headquarters. Romaine, thank you so much. And coming up, we're going to bring the spotlight back to oil, with prices plunging today, as we just discussed with Romaine, as Iran's retaliation spares energy infrastructure. Much more ahead, with analysis from Jennifer Welch of Bloomberg Economics, plus how lawmakers are looking at this escalation in the Middle East. We'll discuss with Democratic Congresswoman Becca Balint of Vermont. That's later this hour on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I can assure you the administration is actively and closely monitoring the situation in the Strait of Hormuz, and the Iranian regime would be foolish to make that decision.
That was the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt earlier today, talking about the Strait of Hormuz and any potential threat Iran may pose to it. That, of course, was followed shortly thereafter by a True Social post by President Trump, specifically highlighting oil prices, saying that everyone should be keeping those prices down, and he is watching. Those prices did indeed come down today. We were down about 9% on both WTI and Brent crude. as the oil market, at least, read Iran's move today to target missiles at a U.S. military base in Qatar rather than the energy markets as being a good sign, at least for oil traders. We want to get more on this now with Jenny Welch, who is our chief geoeconomic strategist at Bloomberg Economics, here with us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Jenny, thank you for being here. We were just speaking with the former Defense Secretary, Leon Panetta, who suggested he thinks this is not the end, but perhaps really only the beginning in terms of what Iran is still going to be willing to do going forward. What probability at this time should we be putting around the idea that at some point energy infrastructure, if not the Strait of Hormuz outright, becomes collateral damage in what's happening in the Middle East?
I think the major risk at this point is what happens between Israel and Iran, because President Trump seems to be suggesting he's made his move, he takes Iran's response in stride, and he's done. I think Iran's response was also sort of symbolic retaliation that suggests they're done with the United States. I think the wild card here is, what does Israel do overnight? And does it continue its strikes against Iran despite President Trump's enthusiastic encouragement to bring an end to this conflict and reach a ceasefire?
Yeah. What did you make of the operation as we've learned it, the decoy operation, one that was executed with extreme precision? Should the world know as much as it does about what the U.S. just completed?
It was a very sophisticated operation, as you noted, involved a lot of decoys, deception, a lot of strategic capabilities. Yes. And I think the question that a lot of commentators have now is, was it worth revealing that much of U.S. capabilities when the results, I mean, we're still gathering details about how much damage was caused and how much Iran might have anticipated and moved out of those facilities before they were struck. But do we reveal a lot in return for not ending the program as President Trump had hoped to?
Well, the president has contended on True Social today that everyone knows that they actually were successful in doing so, even though we have not gotten confirmation from any kind of third party, Jenny, that that is true. How long are we actually going to have to wait for it? Can we even hope that that definitive confirmation will come when there's only so much visibility we have into Iran and what exactly it has done, not only in terms of protecting its infrastructure that the U.S. was targeting, but in terms of moving around its enriched uranium?
My pessimistic take is we'll probably never get an answer to that, in large part because I think Tehran's lesson learned from this entire experience is to hide its capabilities and intentions even further, to go further underground, to further stockpile secretly, to build secret facilities to avoid this kind of outcome in the future, to deny the IAEA further access to Iran in the future. So I don't think we'll ever get final confirmation, at least publicly, of how much, for example, of the enriched uranium that they had stockpiled, they moved out of those facilities in anticipation of an attack, what additional facilities they may be building to sort of make redundant capabilities beyond what was attacked, and how much accumulated knowledge, so to speak, still exists in the mind of many Iranian nuclear scientists who survived.
So you're describing an Iran that is more dangerous, that is a higher risk to our national security than it was before the strikes?
I think there's a serious risk that Iran takes the lessons learned from this, that it just needs to harden its capabilities and hide them better, rather than it needs to completely dismantle them.
Wow. Assuming then it can do something with this stockpile of highly enriched uranium that we cannot locate.
Exactly. And theoretically they can. It's at 60% already. It's a lot easier to get from 60 to 90%.
Jenny, thank you. I know you're incredibly busy right now. Jennifer Welch, Bloomberg Economics. We thank you so much for the insights. Coming up on Balance of Power, a look at Iran's defense capabilities following the missile strike in Qatar today. We're going to talk this out with Jeffrey Lewis, professor at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies at Monterey. Alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington, I'm Joe Matthew. Much more to follow on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think regime change has to be the objective because the Ayatollahs are never going to give up their pursuit of nuclear weapons. They have to be forced out of power. That's the only shot we have at really lasting peace and security in the Middle East. And a strike like this, and potentially others, and certainly Israel's ongoing attacks, can disrupt the regime, can destabilize it.
Former Trump administration National Security Advisor John Bolton talking with us last night in a special edition of Balance of Power in which he discussed the likelihood of a potential regime change in Iran. Joining us now for a closer look at Iran's capabilities, Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, professor at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. Doctor, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us. 400 kilograms, roughly 900 pounds of highly enriched uranium are stashed somewhere in Iran right now. The U.S. apparently does not know where it is, nor does Israel. Where's the uranium?
Yeah, boy, I would really like to know that. You know, this war kicks off with Benjamin Netanyahu saying that Iran has enough nuclear material for as many as 9 nuclear weapons. What he's talking about is that 800 pounds of highly enriched uranium. And, you know, at least right now, Iran's got it, and we don't know where it is.
All right, so with that in mind, what can Iran do with that stockpile? Doctor, there are great concerns about their ability to go from 60 to 90% very quickly. And we don't necessarily need to have a fully manufactured warhead, right? What could Iran do in terms of a dirty bomb or something else to get this uranium to be effective at some point against an enemy?
Well, you know, uranium is not particularly radioactive by itself, so I don't think it would make a very effective dirty bomb. But the reality is that 60% is very close to weapons grade, although Iran would need to enrich it further, and it would need to convert it into metal. That said, that's something it could do relatively quickly if it's retained the facilities. So, you know, in contrast to the president saying that the Iranian nuclear program has been obliterated, you know, it's been damaged, it's been set back, but it's still there, and this material could relatively quickly be turned into a small nuclear stockpile.
Okay, so then the question becomes, other than military force, what can be done to prevent or at the very least monitor that, Jeffrey? Knowing Iran, or at least Iran's parliament, has suggested maybe leaving the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. If the IAEA can't get its eyes on anything, where does that leave us other than completely in the dark?
Well, I mean, I think we are completely in the dark. You know, one of the reasons that I was skeptical of the wisdom of doing this is it's really hard to get at some of this material, which can be kept in really deeply buried facilities and which can, frankly, be moved. We saw some trucks showing up at various nuclear facilities once the strike started. And so, you know, things may have been dispersed. So, you know, really, it's a little silly, but the vice president maybe unintentionally put his finger on the problem where he said that the Trump administration intended to have conversations with Iran about the material. So perhaps asking nicely, I don't know.
I don't know if you saw what the president posted earlier on Truth Social. He says the sites that we hit in Iran were totally destroyed. Everyone knows it. And he began to blame the fake news for, as he calls it, suggesting otherwise. Will we ever know? We were just talking to Jenny Welch from Bloomberg Economics, who suggested there may be never any way to verify the extent of this damage.
Yeah, I think unless you really get on the ground in the facilities, you're not going to know. You know, maybe the Iranians will invite the IAEA in to look at the wreckage. The Iraqis did that after the Israelis bombed the Osirak reactor in the early 1980s. But if they don't open up, you know, really what you have is a model. You have a model of the facility, and you think, you know, if I hit it, it's going to be dead. But that's not quite the same thing as knowing. So, you know, I think one real consequence of shifting from a diplomatic approach to a military approach is that now there is this enormous fog of war about what they have, what we've been able to destroy, and where any of it is.
Well, and when we consider what the diplomatic approach originally, before it was at the very least sidelined, if not temporarily abandoned, Jeffrey, was trying to achieve, at least from the U.S.'s aim, is they didn't want Iran to be able to enrich at all. Iran wants to be able to continue at least its civilian program. Do you see a way for consensus ever to be reached on that kind of fundamental question, that fundamental issue? How do you get around a gap that large?
Yeah, I don't think that you fundamentally can. I mean, I think the Iranians have a lot of pride, and I think they have a sense that making agreements doesn't always work out for them, so they want to retain some opportunity to do something different if the agreement goes south. So I think there's just a fundamental disengagement there. But honestly, I think there's a deeper disengagement, which is there are a lot of people who have said that they wanted a better deal or a different deal. And I don't think that. I mean, I think that there are a lot of people who are using the threat of nuclear weapons to pursue really what is a regime change approach. And I think you heard John Bolton, who, for whatever flaws he has, is a very honest man in this regard. You know, he's not really interested in the nuclear program. He's interested in getting rid of the Islamic Republic.
Will the IAEA ever get back in Iran after this, Doctor?
Boy, I don't know. You know, we've already seen the Iranians talking about, I mean, it was a veiled threat, but they talked about killing the IAEA Director General, Rafael Grossi, who I think has been, extremely objective and fair in this entire process. It seems to me the Iranians are laying the groundwork to end their cooperation with the IAEA. That said, I don't want to foreclose things. Perhaps they'll let them back in. That honestly would be the best outcome for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Jeffrey Lewis, we appreciate your time and insight. Professor at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. Thank you so much. And we want to continue this conversation now and turn to tonight's panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Welcome to you both. While we still obviously, as we were just discussing, have many questions about the fate of Iran's nuclear program, it seems President Trump this evening, Rick, is trying to suggest that the fate of more direct conflict between U.S. and Iran is that hopefully there won't be any more. As he says on True Social, Iran's gotten it all out of their system. Hopefully there will be no further hate. Is that President Trump putting his hands up and saying, look, I'm done here. I don't know about you guys?
Well, he certainly wants to enter into a period of time where they could negotiate something. And, you know, we were just talking about whether or not Iran would open up or not. Well, that would be a prerequisite to a negotiated agreement. Remember, we have massive sanctions on the Islamic regime. They don't have the ability to bank around the world. They are very limited on what they can do with their natural resources, oil. So, yeah, I mean, if Iran wants to play in the world community, which maybe this is the moment for them. They don't have a nuclear program anymore, probably nothing worth saving. So why not, cut a deal with the President of the United States, get Israel off his back and start playing into the world community. And if that's the case, we will know what happened to those reactors. Mm-hmm. We will know what happened to the centrifuges. They will have to disclose what other assets they have in this case, as far as nuclear fuel go.
Yeah.
And by the way, it'd be in their interest to do so.
Mm-hmm. Pull us in off the ledge here, Jeannie. What feels real to you tonight? Are we going so far as to think that we could see a deal with Iran? Do you actually believe that this military tit for tat is over?
It could be. I mean, the honest answer is we all don't know. I was really struck by what the doctor just said about Bolton, and I agree with him. He is an honest player here. He wants regime change. Now, I disagree with John Bolton that regime change in Iran means no nuclear weapons for Iran. The reality is the knowledge, ability to make nuclear weapons cannot be bombed out of a country. And so the very president who blew up an agreement which allowed us to have inspectors in there, put their ability to get this program moving a year off, blew up that deal, fine. And now a few minutes ago, he's on Truth Social talking about peace. Well, there are many people in the world who feel that bombing is not the way to a nuclear peace deal with Iran, or quite frankly, any country. So I have a lot more questions here than I do answers, but the reality is we don't know if there'll be a peace deal, and we don't know if a new Iranian regime, if we get that, is going to be a denuclearized Iran. If you're Iran, looking at the Sunnis around you, the Israelis and everybody else, you're probably not going to give up your ability to reconstruct these programs.
Well, so obviously, in the way things move forward, Jeannie, we have to consider domestic circumstances in Iran, just like we have to consider domestic political pressures the president has to contend with here in the U.S. How much does the isolationist bent of at least the core base of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, and how much does the idea that the president very much does not want to see things like higher oil prices factor into decision-making going forward?
It should factor in. His poll numbers are the lowest right now on issues involving cost of living, on issues involving inflation and the economy, and he full well knows that. like any modern president, if oil prices go up, that will be a problem for Donald Trump. And his real problem now is he's had an ability since he came back in to blame the previous administration. But if oil prices go up as a result of his actions over the weekend, he's not going to have the administration prior to him to blame. So he will have to defend his actions. And he's trying to do that today, talking about drill, baby, drill. But we have to see if that's enough. So he is cognizant of the real vulnerability he has on the economy. And he doesn't want that, what he's done over the weekend, to impact the markets in any way that's going to reflect negatively on him for sure.
Interesting, Rick, that we haven't actually heard from the president since Saturday night when he was in the Cross Hall at the White House with that very brief address to the nation. He's on his way to the NATO summit tomorrow, as far as we know. This trip is still on. To what extent will he use that as a platform to deliver a message after all this?
Oh, I don't think he could help himself, right? I mean, even though it's sort of a page turner, let's focus on Putin, let's focus on Ukraine. That'll be obviously the top topic. He'll get a victory lap because today the NATO members were talking about increasing their GDP share to 5%, which is something he argued for in his first term. So I think you'll see a welcoming of the NATO members in that regard and can have some positive things to say. But, you know, when you get the press around Donald Trump, I mean, he is an instant news machine. And so the reality is he's going to send a message to the Ayatollah about what the next steps are, whether it's germane to the NATO summit or not. And look, I mean, you know, arguably the one group of people who are more likely to be critical of whether or not we've destroyed the Iranian nuclear program are the Israelis, and they're high-fiving tonight. They believe that the system, Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister, told us today on Bloomberg that it's been put back decades. And so they now wake up in the morning without an existential threat to their life based on what they know about what happened over the weekend. And I trust them over anybody else.
Well, we'll have a lot more from the NATO summit in the days ahead. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, we thank you so much for the analysis after an important weekend in geopolitics. And while that is the story this evening, the threat of war has taken the majority of our attention, we do want to bring you this developing news from the Supreme Court. This just from an hour ago, as the highest court of the land rules in favor of the Trump administration, lifting a judge's order that required the White House to give people 10 days notice and a chance to object before they are deported to a so-called third country.
And some other stories that we're following at Bloomberg at this hour. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met with King Charles today at Windsor Castle as part of his state visit to the United Kingdom. Zelensky also held talks with Prime Minister Keir Starmer, where the UK reiterated its support for Ukraine in the ongoing war with Russia. The visit comes ahead of that NATO summit we were just discussing taking place at The Hague starting tomorrow.
And a group of Harvard University alumni urging the school not to cave to the Trump administration's demands as the school restarts talks with the White House. On Friday, President Trump said conversations were underway with Harvard after an escalating standoff that included the cancellation of more than $2.6 billion in research funding. The open letter, the alumni group Crimson Courage, writing, "Standing strong is not merely an operational exercise, it is a moral imperative. The world is watching and needs Harvard's leadership and courage now," unquote.
And New York City voters will head to the polls tomorrow to choose a Democratic candidate for mayor as a sweltering heat wave hits the region. That means long lines and 100-degree weather across the city's 1,200 poll sites. Recent polling shows the frontrunners are former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and New York State Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani. New York City's current Democratic mayor, Eric Adams, is planning to run in the general election as an independent. And still ahead here on Balance of Power, we'll turn back to the Middle East and how lawmakers are looking at the action between the U.S. and Iran with Democratic Congresswoman Becca Balint of Vermont. Next on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
That's the only thing the Constitution says is going to war. The fact is, since Teddy Roosevelt famously said that you can, I'll send the Great White Fleet anywhere I want and you can pay to get them back, presidents have been very open about being the commander-in-chief and taking action, not in waiting for approval of Congress, not even necessarily consulting Congress, but informing Congress. And we were all very informed.
Republican Congressman Darrell Issa of California, vice chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, on last night's special edition of Balance of Power, discussing President Trump's ability to exercise military force in Iran without the formal approval of Congress. Joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is his colleague from across the aisle. Democratic Congresswoman Becca Balint of Vermont is with us. Congresswoman, appreciate your time, as we have just at this hour learned that the White House, or President Trump, has formally notified Congress of Saturday's strikes on Iran, now that we're about 48 hours after the fact. And knowing you have colleagues that are pushing for a vote on a war powers resolution in the House and in the Senate, there's a similar exercise underway. If the president does not intend, as he signaled, to take any further military action against Iran, is that vote still necessary?
Absolutely. It's absolutely still necessary. Look, we have to make sure that we are having a full debate on the House floor out in the open. The American people have said very clearly they do not want us dragged into another war. And I just have to take issue with what my colleague Darrell Issa said on that clip that you just played. The truth of the matter is the people that were informed were Republicans. The entire Gang of Eight that should have been briefed did not include the Democrats, who are high-ranking within the Intelligence Committee and also on military affairs. And so it gives me great concern when you have a president that is only briefing one party, when he has surrounded himself with yes men. We knew leading up to this moment that he has removed dozens and dozens of senior advisors within the intelligence and the military community. I am concerned that the people who are advising him are not folks who have the experience and the temperament to meet this moment.
Well, Congresswoman, I asked Darrell Issa about that. I asked him if that was the new normal, because he seemed to think that this was actually something to celebrate, the fact that there were no leaks that came from this mission, knowing that leaks frequently come from Capitol Hill. And I wonder your thoughts on this. The ranking member, of course, on the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Himes, had no idea this was going to happen. He read about it on social media just like everybody else did. Is this the new normal in Washington?
I fear that this is what Trump is trying to create as the new normal. And look, it's not just about this. It is about the fact that this administration is a complete and total black box. Normally, we would have avenues to get basic information, whether we're in the Judiciary Committee or whether we're in the Budget Committee. We are stonewalled at every possible hearing. And so this is just a continuation of that we will tell the people who are going to give us the answer that we want. And it's just absolutely insulting for Darrell Issa to imply that somehow someone like Jim Himes cannot be trusted. It's outrageous.
Well, when we consider that there are some Republicans, including the likes of Congressman Tom Massey, who have suggested that he does think the president acted unconstitutionally with the events over the weekend, to what extent do you expect these kind of conversations to influence the conduct of this administration going forward? Do you have a real hope in your mind that President Trump may return to Congress if he does decide, indeed, if Iran were to continue to strike, as we saw attempted today, or target other assets in the Middle East, that more military force is necessary, that Congress will be more read in more quickly at that point?
I don't have any confidence in this administration that they will read in Democrats. They have kept us in the dark about so much in the 6 months that they've been in power. But I will tell you this. I am a co-signer on that Tom Massey War Powers resolution, and there are many of my colleagues who feel that this was absolutely an overreach of presidential authority, having these strikes over the weekend on Iran. I know that my constituents are representative of what many of my colleagues are hearing from theirs. They do not want us embroiled in another war. They do not want our boots to be on the ground. And people are deeply concerned about how this offensive strike is going to impact our troops that are stationed all over the Middle East. And of course, we saw that attack in Doha. And so I would like to believe that this administration will change its tune. We are not seeing that, but we're going to continue to make the case that these matters need to be solved diplomatically. This is a highly emotional man who makes decisions on a whim. And I think that we are not safer because of the actions that he carried out without reading in Congress and without consulting people who have been experts in this field for decades.
Well, I know you're speaking out of principle here when it comes to protecting or reasserting Congress's authority when it comes to war powers. I don't think you agree with Tom Massey and a lot of other things. I'm assuming that's the case, Congresswoman.
Politics
so here we are. I just wonder, well, isn't that right? But with that in mind, I wonder if your passion for this topic also means that you don't think this is over between the U.S. and Iran, that a War Powers Act to be signed now might put guardrails on what's left in this conflict.
That's absolutely right. We need guardrails. We need to have a check on the power of this executive. And sadly, my Republican colleagues in many critical instances in the last 6 months have been willing to give over their power and authority. And what that means is they are giving up the power and the authority of the people. We are the chamber that is closest to the people. We are supposed to be representing the needs, the desires, the wishes of the people. And when my colleagues just continue to rubber stamp this administration, but more concerning, give up their power to the executive branch, that isn't making anyone more safe.
And Congresswoman, we just have a minute left here, but knowing as your body works on the will of the people, the Republican majority is suggesting that also needs to take the form of economic measures, fiscal measures like tax cuts through this budget reconciliation package. I just wonder, in our final moment together, what your reaction is to the decision making of the Senate parliamentarian, what's getting taken out of this bill that the House passed.
Yes, well, I'm pleased to see the Senate parliamentarian taking a stand about what can be included and what not, and what cannot be included. I sat in budget negotiations with Republicans, and I know that all the things that we were pointing out to them that would be deeply unpopular with the American people have come to fruition. This is the least popular bill that we've seen moved in Congress, I believe, since 1990 was the report I saw just a few days ago. His numbers are underwater on this bill. This is not a bill that is going to make life better for the least among us and for the middle class. This is a bill that overwhelmingly supports the wealthy at the expense of the rest of us.
It's good to have you with us, Congresswoman, covering some ground this evening. Becca Balint of Vermont, we thank you for your view from the Democratic side of the aisle. And a quick note up next for our TV viewers, a special edition of Asia Trade. It's starting an hour early given the global volatility that we're experiencing. For our radio listeners, stick with us for Bloomberg Law. We'll have a lot more tomorrow on Bloomberg TV.